Hello one and all, I'm Mr. King and you join us for this final video in which we conclude our journey looking at how Hamlet has been presented in the last 400 years. And in our last video we'd got as far as the early 20th century by considering the view of Sigmund Freud. Now, while a number of academics continue to write about Hamlet in the 20th century, one of the things which changed the way that audiences viewed Hamlet, arguably more than anything else, was the fact that Hamlet started being produced in the form of movies and films, and that's what we're going to look at in today's video. Now, movies are a really interesting thing to think about because directors have to emphasise certain elements of the play in their movies, and they will inevitably spend less time on other elements. And so by thinking about the choices that directors make, we can think about other critical interpretations of Hamlet. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. But before we begin, a quick word of advice. If you want to write about different movie productions of Hamlet, then the convention is to refer to the name of the director and the year in which the movie came out. And so, with that in mind, let's look at one of the first movie productions of Hamlet, which was the production by Laurence Olivier, which came out in 1948. So one of the first movie productions of Hamlet both was directed by and starred Laurence Olivier in the role of Hamlet. And really helpfully for us, Olivier made a number of his critical interpretations of Hamlet explicit for us as audiences. For example, he made a really interesting choice in his movie. Before we saw anything else in the film, one of the first things we see is a quote from Act 1, Scene 4, which he puts up on the screen for us. And this quote is not from Act 1, Scene 1, as you might expect, it's from Act 1, Scene 4. And the quote is widely considered by many Shakespearean scholars to be Shakespeare's personal definition of a tragic hero. So in a previous video we looked at Aristotle's definition of a tragic hero. Well, this quote from Act 1 Scene 4 is often seen by many as Shakespeare's definition of a tragic hero. And Olivier chooses to begin his movie with it. Let's have a look. It says, "So oft it chances in particular men, that through some vicious mole of nature in them, by the o'ergrowth of some complexion, oft breaking down the pales and thoughts of reason, or by some habit grown too much, that these men, carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect, their virtues else, be they as pure as grace, shall, in the general censure, take corruption from that particular fault." So this quote suggests that a tragic hero is someone who might be as pure as grace, but they have one vicious mole of nature in them, or they have the stamp of one defect. And because of that stamp of one defect, they'll take corruption from that particular fault, and it will lead to their downfall. So by starting his movie with this quote, Olivier is strongly implying that he views Hamlet as a tragic hero, much like Goethe in the 18th century, who argued that Hamlet sinks beneath a burden which he cannot bear and must not cast away. Now, many reviewers observed that Olivier presented Hamlet as a tragic hero with the emphasis on the word hero. For example, one reviewer, Dixon, in 1948, wrote in the Telegraph, "Olivier, very rightly, plays for sympathy. He attempts to make a ruthless Renaissance prince into a chivalrous English gentleman. Therefore, Olivier's Hamlet is a noble prince, someone who audiences might even look up to." It's also interesting that Dixon acknowledges that Hamlet has the potential to be viewed as ruthless, but this interpretation is suppressed in favour of showing Hamlet as chivalrous. Furthermore, Dixon observes that Olivier's Hamlet plays for sympathy. This production therefore has a number of similarities with how some 17th century critics first viewed Hamlet, who viewed Hamlet as a strong, noble and heroic prince. Now, after that quote from Act 1 Scene 4, which Olivier began his movie with, Olivier then recorded a voiceover of himself speaking in which he said,
"This is the tragedy of a man who could not make up his mind."
So Olivier literally speaks to his audience to tell us what we should think about Hamlet. It's a tragedy of a man who could not make up his mind. And specifically his fatal flaw, or to use Aristotle's word, his hamartia, is the fact that he could not make up his mind. Why could he not make up his mind? Well, Olivier makes his answer clear to that question in the rest of his movie. It's very clear that Olivier was heavily influenced by the work of Sigmund Freud, because he, in his production, suggests very strongly that Hamlet has an Oedipus complex. How do we know that Olivier thought that Hamlet had an Oedipus complex? Well, Olivier made a number of choices that made this very clear. For example, Olivier, who was 41 at the time that he acted the role of Hamlet, cast a 28-year-old Eileen Hurley as Gertrude, and she was often dressed in her scenes in very low-cut gowns. And the closet scene in particular, in which Hamlet throws his mother to her bed, is also very suggestive of a number of Oedipal themes. What do you think? Is Olivier right to conclude that Hamlet's indecision is caused by incestuous feelings towards his mother? Is Olivier right to portray Hamlet as a hero, as a sort of Renaissance prince, I suppose? Let's pause there and consider a very different and even more modern interpretation of Hamlet, and this is the interpretation which influenced my generation, and it's the production directed by director Doran in 2009 and stars David Tennant in the lead role as Hamlet. Now, since 2009, almost every year there's been a new production of Hamlet with a rising star portraying Hamlet the Dane, and I can remember watching this production on Boxing Day, one of its first releases on TV, and I watched it years before I knew I would be teaching it one day. And at the time, when I watched it, I remember being struck by two things. First of all, the eccentricity of David Tennant's Hamlet, and secondly, the fact that throughout the film, you constantly see what's going on from the perspective of CCTV cameras. And that kind of reminds audiences that Hamlet is constantly being watched by Claudius and Polonius. Now, apparently, I'd absorbed some of the key things that Doran had wanted to emphasise in his production, because in an RSC website, a description of the play has this as its title: that David Tennant played Hamlet as an agitated t-shirt and parka wearing wreck in a world where the players never escape observation. Therefore, one key idea that Doran wanted to emphasise in his interpretation of Hamlet is that Hamlet was living in a surveillance state, and this factor clearly had some role in influencing Hamlet's behaviour. Doran actually wrote a diary while he was making this production, and in it he says that Denmark is an intensely dangerous world of hyper-surveillance in which Hamlet himself seems largely politically disinterested. And it's clear that his production emphasises that Denmark is a surveillance state, that everyone is watching each other, and this profoundly affects Hamlet's actions. Now, one thing that's slightly unclear is whether Tennant's portrayal of Hamlet in the surveillance state clearly portrays Hamlet as genuinely mad or pretending, but it's clear that either way the surveillance state did influence the way that he chose to act. But let's go to that question of madness now explicitly. Did Tennant portray Hamlet as mad? Well, one reviewer of Doran's Hamlet, Billington, wrote about this production when it was in theatres the year before it was put to film, which is why the date is 2008 rather than 2009. And in his newspaper, Billington wrote that the overwhelming impression is of a man who, in putting on an antic disposition, reveals his true, nervously excitable, mercurial self. If you're not familiar with the adjective mercurial, it means subject to sudden or unpredictable changes of mood or mind. It's interesting that while some critics view Hamlet's antic disposition as an act, which enables audiences to see a made-up character, a different version of Hamlet that Hamlet wants everyone else to see, here, Billington suggests that Hamlet's antic disposition enables us to see a truer version of Hamlet. And this truer version of Hamlet is an excitable, mercurial personality who is not genuinely mad, but just eccentric and excitable. At least he doesn't say he's not genuinely mad, but I think that's the inference we can make. And I agree with this review of the movie. Tennant's Hamlet, to me, does not come across as mad, just eccentric. but fundamentally in control, and as a result he's extremely dislikable, especially in the way that he treats Ophelia and Gertrude. He also seems to enjoy offending others and causing hurt. For example, in this scene with Hamlet and Polonius, Tennant doesn't read the scene as someone who's a incoherent, rambling madman, but he makes pointed pauses and throws deliberate looks to show that he's trying to offend Polonius and cause as much hurt as possible.
For the satirical rogue says here that old men have grey beards, that their faces are wrinkled.
Therefore, I think mercurial is a good word to describe Tennant's Hamlet, someone who is possibly not completely mad, but certainly eccentric, and someone who can be quite cruel along the way. In our second lecture, we briefly considered the question of whether audiences should feel sympathy or condemnation towards Hamlet. I find it very difficult to sympathise with the Hamlet portrayed by David Tennant, although as an audience member, I do find his portrayal bizarrely captivating. One final comment about Doran's interpretation. Unlike Olivier, Doran explicitly rejected the Freudian analysis of the Oedipal nature of the closet scene. But also, unlike Olivier's hero, here Hamlet is slightly more relatable. So unlike the chivalrous prince of Olivier's production, here Tennant's Hamlet wears cool t-shirts. He's less princely in his portrayal, more of a human being going through a really tough time. Therefore, Doran's Hamlet appears more relatable and human, even if he's inhumane in his treatment of others. But what do you think? Who do you think captured the essence of Hamlet better? Did Olivier or did Doran? Let's look at one final interpretation of Hamlet. And I'll end with a very recent adaptation of Hamlet, and this is the 2018 production of Hamlet that was performed at the Globe Theatre, but a recording was made of it so we can see it on film. And this was directed by Michele Terry, who also performed in the lead role of Hamlet herself. Now, a number of female actors have performed the role of Hamlet, and Terry continues that tradition, and her production took that idea even further. The casting of the play was very gender fluid. For example, a number of female actresses performed roles that were historically performed by men, and vice versa. Now, Terry's Hamlet was very different from Doran's interpretation. For example, Billington, who also wrote about this production, observes that there is no sense of Elsinore as a place of eavesdropping corruption. Therefore, whereas Doran's interpretation really emphasised that the surveillance state influenced Hamlet's behaviour, here Terry's production much less so. Now, one of the most interesting elements of Terry's production for me is that shortly after Hamlet declares an intention to put on an antic disposition, Hamlet puts on a clown costume. Now, this is significant because here Hamlet is portrayed as a jester, and jesters are fundamentally performers. And this decision to put on a clown outfit implies that Hamlet is choosing to feign madness. He is acting as mad, and he is not genuinely descended into madness. As Billington put it, the most controversial touch is her later appearance in a clown costume, a slightly too obvious way of signalling Hamlet's assumed madness. After all, if you've chosen to put on a particular outfit, that implies you've made a choice to present yourself in a certain way. Therefore, Terry's Hamlet doesn't seem to slip into genuine madness, but chose to act in a crazy manner. Then, when Hamlet's returning from exile at the start of Act 5, Terry's Hamlet's wearing a very normal and smart-looking coat, which reinforces the idea that an antic disposition was just an act put on for the benefit of those who would see Hamlet at court. This, therefore, seems very much to match the view of Johnson, who argued that Hamlet's madness was feigned or pretended, and Terry's production really emphasises this more than any other production I've seen of Hamlet. But what do you think? Which interpretation of Hamlet of the three we've looked at today best captures the Hamlet that you see when you read Shakespeare's written word? Do you like Olivier's Hamlet, the chivalrous gentleman and tragic hero who suffers from an Oedipus complex? Do you prefer Doran's Hamlet, the mercurial eccentric Hamlet who comes across as callous while coping with a hyper-surveillance state? Or do you prefer Terry's Hamlet, who puts on a clown outfit at the same time as she puts on an antic disposition and then discards it when it's no longer necessary? And that pretty much brings us to the modern day. And so before I end this video and this series of lectures looking at how Hamlet has been presented in the last 400 years, let me end with one final question. Of the views we've seen today, which do you most resonate with? Why do you think that is? And of the views you most agree with, what evidence from Shakespeare's written word can you find to support that? Because that's what you will need to do if you're writing about Hamlet in an exam. I'm going to end there. I hope you found this look at Hamlet useful, and I'm going to end it here. So until next time, best of luck and cheerio.